so badly, and Harry too, that I wanted to know what happened before. What was her life about? And all this, what we've seen this last week, is absolute media manipulation of the most extraordinary kind. First of all, this dancing at the Beyoncé concert, and doesn't visit him, and talks about family values. These are two real imposters, and what is really annoying is...
This story doesn't start with a scream. It starts with something far more dangerous: silence. Because this is the same woman who threatens lawsuits over headlines, but stayed completely silent when a whole book exposed her life. And that silence is where everything fell apart. She threatens lawsuits over headlines, but stayed completely silent when a whole book exposed her life. So, what did Tom Bauer write that Meghan Markle couldn't fight? That question hung in the air like smoke, because everyone knew the pattern. Bad press comes out, lawyers warm up, statements get drafted, anonymous sources close to Meghan start whispering to friendly outlets. That's the routine, except this time it never came. And that's when people started leaning forward.
Interview around sort of 80 sources, I think it was, for this book. Now, I mean, the majority of those people were willing to speak relatively negatively about Meghan, so some would then suggest that the book is biased.
Let's start with the quiet, not the peaceful kind, the loud, awkward, everyone is staring at you kind. Because when Tom Bauer dropped Revenge in 2022, the world waited for Meghan Markle to do what she always does: clap back. Lawsuit threats, statements, carefully leaked sources close to Meghan insisting everything was unfair, untrue, and misogynistic. You know the routine, but this time, nothing. No outrage, no legal warnings, no dramatic interview, just silence. And that silence felt wrong, because this wasn't a blogger, this wasn't a tweet thread, this wasn't a tabloid guessing in the dark. This was Tom Bauer, a man who doesn't write unless he stacked his files floor to ceiling.
It's not biased in the sense that I do my very best to balance it, and there's a lot of good things about Meghan there. She's ambitious, she's good looking, she is determined, she succeeded in getting a good script with suits and everything.
Now, let's be clear, Meghan has survived bad press before. Tabloids, commentators, Twitter threads, even entire opinion columns tearing her apart. She's brushed those off with practiced ease. But Tom Bauer, different beast entirely. Different because he documents. Different because he corroborates. Different because when he writes, he does it knowing exactly how far the law allows him to go.
She's good looking, she is determined, she succeeded in getting a good script with suits and everything, and in the end she succeeded in getting a man.
He didn't rely on one angry source or one disgruntled former friend. He talked to many people: former staff, old friends, industry contacts, people from completely different eras of Meghan's life who had never met each other. And yet they all described eerily similar experiences. That's when things stop sounding like haters and start sounding like patterns. And patterns are poison in court. You can argue opinion, you can scream bias, but you cannot sue consistency. What made this book lethal wasn't a single accusation, it was repetition. Different people, different continents, same emotional outcome. And here's the part Meghan likely hated most. Bauer didn't scream accusations, he didn't exaggerate, he laid out timelines, he showed sequences, he let readers connect the dots themselves. That's journalist kryptonite proofwriting. You don't fight it with outrage, you don't win against it with threats. And that explains why the legal thunder never arrived. Weeks passed, the book kept selling. Clips circulated, debates erupted, still nothing. Months later, the silence was impossible to ignore. People weren't just talking about what Bauer wrote anymore, they were talking about why Meghan wasn't saying anything. Because when someone ignores a full-length biography about their life, that's not forgetfulness, that's strategy or fear. And here's where it started to sting. Silence starts to look like agreement, or at least acceptance. And Meghan understands optics better than almost anyone alive. She knows when timing dies, so does power. Then came the pattern, the one that people couldn't unsee once it was laid out. It always began the same way: warm, intense, constant communication, the feeling of being chosen, friend, staff member, professional ally. Then something shifted, messages slowed, access disappeared, warmth turned cold, and suddenly they were gone. Different people, same ending. And that's the part you can't easily sue away, because these weren't coordinated stories. That's when the Victoria Beckham chapter landed like ice water, because on paper that relationship should have been perfect: fashion, fame, global exposure. But according to Bauer, Meghan didn't just want dresses, she wanted compensation. a business arrangement, money layered on top, and royal rules said no. So the warmth cooled, communication turned formal, another door closed, not with drama, with finality. And then there was her father, not framed as spectacle, not milked for pity, presented as another clean break. Meghan and her father have not spoken in years. No gradual fade, no middle ground, just severed. Bauer didn't psychoanalyze, he didn't insult, he observed. When trust breaks in her world, doors don't stay cracked open, they shut. That same finality appeared everywhere: staff, advisors, friends. When the same outcome appears across family, friendships, and career relationships, it stops looking situational. And once readers saw it, they couldn't unsee it. Then came the most dangerous shift of all: the reframing. Bauer didn't portray Meghan as someone swept into fame. He showed ambition, long-term planning, strategic alignment. Meghan didn't stumble into success, she pursued it from an early age. Branding, networking, positioning, not accidental, deliberate, which shattered the victim narrative, because you cannot carefully construct a global brand and then claim surprise when the spotlight turns on. And here's the part no one talks about quietly. Tom Bauer has admitted publicly that more exists, more interviews, more material, more stories that never made print. In legal and media terms, unpublished material represents leverage. That's why no lawsuit came, because discovery is dangerous. Cross-examination is ruthless, and silence suddenly makes sense. But silence has a cost. Media fear evaporated. Coverage changed. YouTubers stopped tiptoeing. Outlets stopped hedging. The silence functioned as permission. And once permission exists, narratives expand. By the time any response could have come, it would have looked desperate. And the final truth settled in. This wasn't about one scandal. It was about structure, patterns, consistency. What Tom Bauer exposed wasn't a hidden scandal. It was consistent. And consistency is persuasive. In the end, revenge didn't endure because of outrage, it endured because of quiet. And that quiet said more than any lawsuit ever could. And the silence didn't just sit there quietly, it grew teeth. Because once the media realized there would be no pushback, no legal letters, no furious rebuttals, something fundamental shifted. Editors stopped flinching. Commentators stopped softening their language. Producers stopped adding disclaimers like allegedly and reportedly every other sentence. The fear barrier collapsed. And when that happens, stories don't just continue, they multiply. People who had stayed quiet for years suddenly felt safer speaking in general terms. Not naming names, not spilling secrets, just confirming vibes, confirming atmospheres, confirming that the experiences described in the book felt familiar. And that's all it takes. Because gossip doesn't need courtroom proof, it needs recognition. And that recognition spread. What was once framed as isolated drama started being discussed as a system, a way of operating, a recognizable cycle. And the public, once they understand the cycle, start applying it retroactively. They go back, they rewatch old interviews, they reread statements, they look at moments that once seemed confusing and suddenly think, oh, that fits now. That's the danger of pattern-based storytelling. It rewires memory. Moments that once looked like misunderstandings now felt intentional. Professional fallouts that were brushed off as creative differences started looking like exits. Relationships that ended abruptly were no longer mysterious, they were predictable. And when predictability replaces confusion, sympathy drains fast. This is where the narrative really turned. Because for years, the dominant framing had been fragility, overwhelm, being swept up by forces too big to control. But once the idea of long-term strategy entered the picture, everything rebalanced. Strategy implies choice. Choice implies responsibility. And responsibility changes how people judge behavior. The silence didn't refute that reframing, it reinforced it. And every week that passed without a response quietly confirmed something else, that there was no clean counter-narrative ready to deploy. No neat explanation that could dismantle the timeline. No single statement that could say, here's where this falls apart. Because dismantling a pattern requires specifics. Dates, decisions, context, and specifics invite questions. Questions invite follow-ups. Follow-ups invite scrutiny. Silence avoids all of that, but it also forfeits control. What's rarely acknowledged is how exhausting silence becomes when it stretches too long. At first, it feels powerful, strategic, calm, but eventually it starts to look like avoidance. And avoidance in the public imagination always implies something to hide, even if that implication is unfair. Optics don't care about fairness. perfectionists, they care about repetition, and repetition was now working against her. Every interview Tom Bauer gave after the book's release extended the life of the story. Every time he calmly explained his process, his sourcing, his legal vetting, it reinforced credibility. He didn't sound defensive. He didn't sound triumphant. He sounded methodical. And methodical people are dangerous in scandals because they don't trigger emotional backlash, they trigger trust. What made it worse was the asymmetry. One side speaking steadily, the other saying nothing at all. Over time, even neutral observers started drawing conclusions, not about guilt, but about confidence. People tend to believe that confident people respond. Silence in this context didn't read as dignity. It read as calculation that had run out of options. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Once a narrative matures without resistance, it hardens. It stops being a book says and starts becoming a commonly understood version, not proven, not legally established, but socially accepted. And social acceptance is far more powerful than facts when it comes to reputation. By the time months had passed, responding wasn't just risky, it was futile. Any denial would be framed as finally speaking up. Any legal threat would be mocked as too late. Any emotional appeal would be dissected for timing rather than content. The window had closed, and everyone knew it. This is where the idea of fear really enters the conversation. Not fear of the book, but fear of the process that would follow any challenge to it. Because challenging it wouldn't stop at public statements. It would escalate, and escalation means loss of control. In a courtroom, narratives are dismantled line by line. Witnesses speak under oath. Past statements are compared. Timelines are cross-checked. Private communications become exhibits. And most importantly, unpublished material doesn't stay unpublished. That's the nuclear risk. And Tom Bauer made sure people understood that risk without ever threatening it. He simply mentioned calmly, repeatedly, that more existed, that choices had been made about what to include, that restraint had been exercised. Those statements weren't warnings, but they functioned as them. So silence became the least dangerous option. But least dangerous doesn't mean harmless. Because while silence avoided escalation, it allowed something else to happen: reinterpretation. Other commentators began building frameworks on top of Bauer's work, not adding new allegations, just applying his lens to current events. And once a lens exists, everything passes through it. Actions were no longer judged individually. They were grouped, compared, categorized. And when people start categorizing behavior, reputation shifts from emotional to analytical. Analytical judgment is cold. It doesn't forgive easily. What's particularly striking is how the book changed the tone of future criticism. Before, criticism often felt cautious, even apologetic. Afterward, it became observational. Less "this is wrong" and more "this is consistent." That difference matters. Observational criticism feels neutral. Neutral criticism feels credible. And credibility sticks. Another subtle consequence of the silence was how it affected allies. Without a clear rebuttal to rally behind, supporters were left defending abstractions instead of facts. They could argue misogyny, media bias, unfair scrutiny, but they couldn't point to specific errors in the book because none were formally identified. And defending in generalities is exhausting. Over time, even loyal voices grow quieter. Silence isolates. Eventually, the conversation wasn't even about the book anymore. It was about what the response to the book revealed, or didn't. And that meta-conversation became louder than the original text. People weren't dissecting chapters, they were dissecting absence. Why this book? Why this author? Why this reaction? Those questions echoed longer than any quote. And the final irony is this: the lawsuit talk didn't collapse because the legal system failed. It collapsed because it was never activated. Threats mean nothing if they're not followed through. Over time, they start to sound performative. And once something sounds performative, it loses power. What remained was a vacuum, and vacuums get filled with interpretation, with speculation, with pattern recognition. By choosing not to engage, the book was allowed to stand unchallenged, not as truth, but as reference. And references shape discourse. They become the starting point for future conversations. They define the frame. That's why Revenge didn't fade. It settled, not with a bang, not with a verdict, but with quiet acceptance. And in the world of public perception, quiet acceptance is often the most permanent outcome of all. Permanent outcome of all. Permanent outcome of all. Permanent outcome.